How are you doing, Jobin?
Good, I'm fine, Andrew. So good to see you. It must be really morning, like nice.
Yeah, the sun has just come up. Well, sun's been up for about 15 minutes, I think, or 20.
Good. It must be a nice fall day, early fall day, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I had a huge set of thunderstorms come through last night, but it seems to have cleared the air. Power only flickered for a bit. I was worried about that. We
it's
got
okay.
through.
I mean, yeah, I saw that email. I mean, you said there was some, yeah.
We've been noticing a more active hurricane season here. The seas are beginning to warm a bit more, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we'll wait for a couple of minutes more, Andrew, because
Sure.
We'll wait for a few more people to come in.
I haven't done screen share before when I've done this, so I'll try it out.
Yeah. So you should be able to, you would have the button, right?
Yeah, the share screen, yeah. Just not sure which screen is better.
Okay, good. So the screen share is fine. It's working fine.
Oh, you can see it?
Yeah, you can see it. Yeah, it's all great.
I was just wondering if I could also see my box. So you could see the slideshow if I press that?
Yes, that's
okay.
also fine, yeah.
Okay.
Where is that Buddha statue from?
I took the photograph myself. I think it is in Bulgaria, but I'm not sure. It'll be one of my picks. I tend to only use, I went and picked some public domain picks for some of the slideshow, but those top ones are mine. The one on the right is a pillar, Ashoka pillar from, I think, Sarnath.
Sure, yeah.
It was a real treat to see the Ashoka pillar. It's such a moving part of history.
Yeah. Okay, so let's see. Just still, let's look at the people. Let's see if I can exit full screen. We have about 15 people.
Okay.
So we'll wait for one more minute if it's okay for you, Andrew.
Oh, sure. Yeah, no, you're totally, you steer the ship. I was taking your advice about the way that pictures of the virus are displayed when you were opening up the conference yesterday. So I changed the photograph from a cartoon to an electron microscope.
It's a good one.
You already impacted the way I was doing the slideshow.
That's good. In fact, one of the presentation sessions just got over. That's the reason why people are just coming in.
Oh, sure. I don't mind waiting.
Sorry, just one more minute, maybe. Okay, I'll introduce you now.
Okay.
And then we will slowly set up the context. So Dr. Andrew Fenton is going to speak now. Thank you, Andrew, for agreeing to be a speaker for our Contagion Narratives Conference. Dr. Andrew Fenton is an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy at Dalhousie University, Halifax, Canada. It's the eastern coast of Canada, the Atlantic coast. He holds a PhD in philosophy from the University of Calgary. His research interests include animal ethics, philosophy of animal cognition and behavior, and Buddhist philosophy. He has authored or co-authored papers that have appeared in journals like Biology and Philosophy, Cambridge Quarterly of Healthcare Ethics, Developing World Bioethics, Journal of Animal Ethics, Journal of Bioethical Inquiry, Journal of Ethics in Mental Health, Journal for the Theory of Social Behavior, Neuroethics, Public Health Ethics, and The Monist. Fenton has also co-authored or co-edited 2 books, Chimpanzee Rights, The Philosopher's Brief, Routledge 2019, and Neuroethics and Non-Human Animals. I also want to add that I know Andrew personally. So Andrew is involved in a serious research. I mean, serious, not just research interest, it's also a kinder treatment to animals and other living beings, and even to people who are considered non-mainstream. So just wanted to add that also along with the yes. Given introduction. Thank you.
Do you want me to start?
Yeah, please start. Yeah.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much to the organizers for giving me the opportunity to present some of my work. I really appreciate the opportunity, and good afternoon to you all. So I'll start the slideshow. There's my email address. So if you want to reach out to me and follow up on anything that happens in the presentation or in the Q&A, please feel free. I'd love to keep a conversation going. So, and I'm sure the organizers will share my email address too. I mean, that's fine. Is my audio coming through okay? Is that...
Yeah, it's all fine. Yeah, good.
Okay, just get my slideshow. So here's my plan for today. I'll make some orientating comments about COVID-19 and what I'll discuss. I'll use a couple of examples of how animals have fared during this pandemic to set up the ethics that will happen afterwards. I'll offer you a brief outline of what I'm calling standard animal research ethics. This is the dominant frame, for better or for worse. I'm certainly not a huge fan of the standard frame, but I'll give you a rough lay of the land so you can see where I think a Buddhist interrogation will actually do a lot of good work, I think. And then I'll introduce Buddhist infused animal research ethics. I'll say a little bit more about why I use the term Buddhist infused. It has mostly to do with the diversity of Buddhist thought in the Buddhist world. And so it has to do with the complexity of that. And so this is only a way to do things rather than the way to do things. I'm very aware of that. And then I'll offer some conclusions. So at least two distinct, though sometimes complementary framings of the COVID-19 pandemic are evident in the media. One frame pits us, that is global humanity, against an enemy novel virus, SARS-CoV-2, and accompanying human disease, COVID-19. A second frame laments the lessons we have failed to learn from past zoonotic pandemics, particularly ones associated with our food systems or practices, and the urgent need to learn from this one. Both frames are responsive to features of the pandemic and the global societal response. Though there is still much to learn about this virus, the disease resulting from infection can get so severe that it either threatens the long-term health of those who survive or kills the infected. That severe disease or death are statistically rare is small comfort when faced with the possibility that a significant portion of the global population could get infected. With a large enough number of the global population infected, many will end up with quite serious survivor complications or die, no matter their rarity. Battling COVID-19 begins to take on the feel of a war, with governments and industry devoting much time, money, and energy into beating the pandemic. Individual citizens have been drafted into the cause, as each does their part to keep themselves and their loved ones as healthy as possible. Daily lives have been deeply disrupted, with many facing financial and personal hardships and a lack of adequate health care for ailments or health needs unrelated to the pandemic. This framing of an us against an it has been carried further. As has been noted in some recent media stories, various scientists hunt for viruses with spillover potential, and they assure us that such viruses exist in the wild corners of our world, ready to threaten us again should we have an unfortunate encounter with a host or infected animal. Other animals on this planet out in the wilds pose a threat that may rival COVID-19 or even past pandemics like the 1918 flu. Under such a framing, we are surrounded by enemies. As I have suggested, this first framing can be described in ways that elide our complicity in the current crisis, even though this is not to deny that many of those taking this way have advice about how we can protect ourselves in the future. But this pandemic was not just dropped on us from an outside source. It is true that this pandemic teems with viruses and that the likely source of SARS-CoV-2 are free-living, aka wild bats. But if we are to avoid even greater crises in COVID-19, we must not shrink from the recognition that humans had a hand in its making, or so advocates of the second framing would have it. This pandemic may have originated in bats, but a live wildlife meat market in the Chinese province of Hubei is implicated as either a source or amplifier. As a global human community, we contribute to conditions that make such pandemics more likely through intensive or crowded animal farming, live wildlife meat markets, and habitat loss or habitat incursion. The last global pandemic occurred in 2009. The zoonotic virus was a strain of H1N1. They've christened it H1N1 PDM09. Though the resulting flu pandemic was milder than public health professionals feared, it still killed around 150,000 people worldwide and posed a greater health threat to individuals under the age of 65, unlike seasonal flus. It is now thought that H1N1 PDM09 originated in farmed pigs in Mexico, a hybrid strain with a parent strain remaining in farmed pigs in Mexico. It's still there. The second framing of the COVID-19 pandemic raises deep issues about the way that we humans live together and also how we coexist with other animals who live on this planet. Along with these issues come questions about the values that we currently express in our current choices, practices, or traditions, as well as the values we ought to favor. I will focus this paper on a discussion of such values through a critical examination of animal research ethics. Animal research strongly intersects with the unfolding story of COVID-19 and its global impact. As I will briefly detail in the second section, animals have been adversely affected by public health measures to flatten the curve of the pandemic, as well as utilized in the pursuit of a deeper understanding of the disease and the development of an effective vaccine. For the third section, I will provide a very quick orientation to animal research ethics that will be recognized by ethically literate animal researchers. So if you're an animal researcher here, you'll recognize it. This sets up the discussion of the fourth section, which draws on some of my previous work on Buddhist animal bioethics to show how some emergent fundamental principles in animal research ethics can be strengthened to the benefit of animals. That there is no one approach to either ethics or animals in Buddhism means that what I say here is a way of developing a Buddhist-infused animal research ethics, but by no means the only way. Regardless of that limitation, a Buddhist-infused ethics provides tools that both align with progressive elements of the literature in animal research ethics and can encourage further advancements. I will introduce 11 draft principles that arise from a Buddhist-infused animal research ethics that both interpret emergent fundamental principles in the animal research ethics in progressive ways and tie back to how laboratory animals have fared during the 2020 pandemic. A concluding section can then briefly indicate how a Buddhist concept outlined in the fourth section impacts considerations I raised in this introduction to explain the second framing of the COVID-19 pandemic. So how animals have fared. As public health measures emerged in response to rapidly spreading COVID-19, many university laboratories began to close down all but essential research. Many administrators asked animal researchers and veterinarians to work together to depopulate, as the phrase has become quite common, their captive animal populations. As the research world has scrambled to better understand SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19, it continues old patterns of animal use. Various animal models, and I mean a lot, including cats, ferrets, mice, and macaques, have been used to understand how the virus spreads or how the severity of the resulting disease can be lessened if not avoided. Both of these uses can come with high costs to the animals used. As they provide details of importance to Buddhist-infused animal research ethics, let's briefly take each of the examples in turn. Joining efforts to flatten the pandemic curve, many universities on continents like North America went into lockdown during the second term of the 2019-2020 academic year and required faculty members to finish what was left of their courses online. For universities that had them, pandemic or crisis management plans were activated, and for those who had nothing official, and there were universities that didn't, ad hoc plans were devised. Administrators reached out to science faculty members using animals in their work to close down non-essential, that is non-health or non-COVID-19 related research, as well as to in-house veterinarians to help with the process. Non-essential workers were asked to stay off campus and staff hours were reduced. In light of these public health measures, the task facing university laboratories with large numbers of animals was to ensure that animal care remained adequate as stipulated in regulatory standards and in-house operating procedures, and that's an important caveat. Efforts were initiated to control the size of laboratory populations. Breeding was stopped, for instance. And many, though not all, laboratories chose to depopulate some of their populations by killing them. Reports to date only seem to mention laboratory rodent populations. It must be noted that some laboratories, or more accurately, scientists in these laboratories, also relocated or released some of their laboratory animals. Media stories covering these efforts tracked the pressures and emotional strain on those who were killing large numbers of laboratory animals so quickly. An addendum to such details was the concern about how quickly some research projects could be restarted once public health measures sufficiently relaxed. Part of the challenge was the length of time it would take to replace the number of animals lost in the depopulation efforts. Once these measures are lifted, we can reasonably expect that animal laboratories will put a great deal of effort into ensuring that their animal captive populations are restored to a size required to meet the demands of scientists engaged in various animal-related scientific activities. It is likely the population numbers will match what they were before the pandemic. In the context of COVID-19, animal models, cats, mice, ferrets, and rhesus macaques among them, are used to understand how the disease progresses, how SARS-CoV-2 is transmitted, how infection can be prevented, and how COVID-19 can be better managed, including lessening its severity. Mice and ferrets are common models for certain certain human respiratory infectious diseases, and have been used to both see how SARS-CoV-2 can be transmitted and to follow the progression of the disease in vivo, that is in the living system. As mice seem resistant to the virus, gain of function experiments have increased the infectiousness of SARS-CoV-2. They do it through passage of mice that are infected, so that mice are much more susceptible and the disease is more severe. To better model severe cases of COVID-19 and to compensate for relevant differences in disease expression between humans and favored animal models, some animal models, reports focus on mice, but occasionally rats as well, have been modified to carry a human ACE2 receptor, it's ACE2 if you're looking for it, on the relevant cell walls. SARS-CoV-2 seems to infect human cells starting in the upper respiratory tract through their ACE2 receptors, which is why they're humanizing the mice and some of the rats this way. How many animal models adequately express severe cases of COVID-19 is disputed, with doubts being expressed in print and preprint. As noted in some media interviews, there is an expectation that there will be no one-size-fits-all model for COVID-19. Different models will be used to study a variety of target features. In developing vaccines, animal models are used in challenge trials, where the animals are first inoculated with a trial vaccine and then exposed to various dose levels of SARS-CoV-2. Is my audio still coming through okay? Is it still? To the best of my knowledge, the animals used as COVID-19 models who do not die of the disease are eventually killed so that their organs and tissues can be studied. For my purposes here, we do not need to concern ourselves with too many of the details of what animal model best targets what in the race to develop a vaccine or effective intervention. And I'm not a scientist, I'm just a philosopher. What we should note are the various accounts of pathologies in animals used as models. SARS-CoV-2 has proved lethal to some chimeric, that is the humanized mice, the HACE2 mice, and some African green monkeys. In an experiment at the, sorry, let me start the clause again. And some African green monkeys in an experiment at the Tulane National Primate Research Center became so ill with pneumonia that they were euthanized earlier than planned. Singh et al. Describe rhesus monkeys with, quote, severe interstitial pneumonia. Some inbred mice, and that's like the some of the albino mice you'll see in some of the pictures on the slide. Some inbred mice with, quote, acute inflammatory responses closely related to the damage of lung tissue, unquote. And some chimeric mice with, quote, severe lung pathology. And golden Syrian hamsters, which turn out to be an animal model that gets quite readily infected with the virus, with, quote, rapid breathing, loss of weight, and diffuse lung damage, unquote. She et al. Report that examinations of kittens used as models who had, quote, died or were euthanized, unquote, 3 days after they were inoculated with SARS-CoV-2, revealed massive lesions in both the mucous membranes of their noses and their lungs. There is much in what I've described in this section that will be of concern to a Buddhist-infused animal research ethics. At the best of times, laboratory settings are stressful for many animals used in them. Negative stressors include light-dark cycles, typically set to accommodate human personnel rather than the needs of captive animals. Various mechanical noises, noises of conspecifics, that is members of their own species, and heterospecifics, that is members of other species, stressed conspecifics and stressed heterospecifics, inadequate physical or social enrichment, that is stimulation and near caging, handling, cage cleaning, veterinary care, and of course procedures like injections and the resulting discomfort from infection and advancing disease. Also of interest are the facts that these negative stressors arise as a direct or indirect result of human choices, and that these animals are purposefully killed, either as part of depopulation efforts or as a part of or result of their scientific use. Both depopulation and COVID-19 animal modeling also reflect a view of animals as sufficiently lower in moral status that they can be housed, dispatched, or used in ways that I have briefly described. Typically, the scientific use of animals does not occur in an ethics vacuum. It is to some of those details that we'll now turn. And just so you know, both there's just another way of saying that both those examples are sites of harm. It is safe to say that the ethics framework on display in much published work in bioethics continues to be of Western origin. This is no less true when we narrow our gaze to animal bioethics. The predominant ethical framework in animal research ethics is consequentialist, although it is important to note that it does not mean that it is utilitarian. Fundamentally, animal research is defended on the grounds of benefits, aka positive outcomes, primarily to humans, but occasionally on the grounds of benefits to animals and the environment too. Appeals to benefits or positive outcomes are appeals to positive consequences. Such defenses contend that advances in scientific understanding and medical interventions could not have been made without the aid of animal models. Future advances in science and medicine are said to depend on the continued use of animal models. The reduction of human suffering in the past and future are also outcomes or consequences foregrounded in defenses of the scientific use of animals. Generally speaking, there are several elements in the ethical infrastructure governing the use of animals in science that are worth noting. Harm or cost benefit analyses are increasingly expected to be a sign, or as early steps are in assessing the acceptability of pursuing a scientific study or research using sentient animals. Or to be more accurate, animals falling under the relevant regulatory or legal structures governing the scientific use of animals. As you know, in countries like the US, rats, birds, and mice aren't covered by law. Though significant difficulties attach to determining a common currency to be used to effectively weigh harms or costs against benefits, the idea behind the analyses is relevantly simple. Benefits should sufficiently outweigh the known harms or costs in order for proposed research to get a green light to proceed to the next stage of ethical evaluation. There is little doubt among scientists that research stressors are well known, research can cause significant harms or come at great cost to the sentient animals who are used. Negative stressors are well known to experienced scientists, largely because they should not be ignored. Quite apart from ethical concerns about harm, such stressors can induce in vivo responses, that is, in-body responses, that confound, that is, mask the data they're gathering on a target or objective study. The basic interests of sentient animals can be overridden in such analyses, in contrast to ethical analyses of the proposed use of many humans in research, reveals the much lower moral status accorded other animals. Though sufficient benefit might be understood as a high bar to meet when weighed against the harms or costs to animals, that's not the reality of animal use. The use of animals in basic research, where the sought after benefit is greater understanding, should remind us that much will stand or fall on how the anticipated advances in understanding is valued. If advancing science is understood to enjoy intrinsic or non-derivative value, then when sentient animal models are judged necessary for that advancement, it's likely they will be used. Even where scientific understanding is understood, to enjoy extrinsic or derivative value, that animals can be used in such contexts where the likelihood of the anticipated benefit is unknown but hoped for, think of lots of basic research, reveals either a low bar for the sufficiency of anticipated benefits because it's just ephemeral, or an extremely low moral status accorded to the animals used, or probably both. What has become known as the 3 Rs, replacement, reduction, and refinement, is widely regarded as a central ethical principle or set of principles. I tend to think of them as a set of principles governing the scientific use of animals. As a principle or set of principles, the 3 Rs are envisioned as ways to reduce the inhumaneness of the scientific use of animals. Consequently, harm and its reduction or elimination should be foremost in the minds of scientists and animal care committees when using the 3 Rs to evaluate proposed animal use. 1 R in particular is already entangled in some of what I've just outlined about harm or cost benefit analyses. Replacement revolves around the question of whether the proposed animal model is necessary to achieve the sought after scientific outcomes. Excuse me for that break for some lubrication. Replacement can be either absolute, in which case no sentient animals need to be used to achieve the sought after scientific outcomes, and so should not be, or relative, in which case a sentient animal taken to be vulnerable to less harm should be favored over those who might ordinarily be proposed as models. After efforts to replace are resolved one way or the other, most of the time they're not replaced, reduction should be considered. This can amount to reducing the overall numbers of sentient animals who are to be used, or reducing their numbers to the minimum necessary to secure sought after scientific outcomes. Once reduction efforts are resolved, refinement should be considered. Refinement is geared toward ameliorating or eliminating scientifically unnecessary negative stress or distress. Though the traditional focus was the period of time covering the animal's use in a study or experiment, that was Russell and Birch's traditional focus. They're the originators of the principles. It typically now includes basic husbandry and their captive experience before and after use, should they survive use. Before connecting these details to a Buddhist-infused ethics, it is important to note 3 emergent principles out of this kind of ethical infrastructure, as well as some contemporary discussions of Western animal research ethics. These principles can undergo a significant reinterpretation through a Buddhist ethics lens, or so I will shortly argue. Sufficient benefit and minimizing harm emerge from a discussion of harm or cost benefit and the 3 Rs. 2 principles with counterparts in human research ethics that capture these values are beneficence, what I am calling sufficient benefit, and non-maleficence. Unlike their human counterparts, these principles in animal research ethics do not assume a high moral status accorded to research subjects. What's more, they do not constrain use to protect the subject from significant harm. Nevertheless, they reasonably stand as fundamental ethical principles in the scientific use of animals. There is a third principle that is gaining traction in animal research ethics: respect for sentient animals, or as I've argued elsewhere, respect for intentional agents. Respectful use of animals in science is sometimes put in terms of seeing animal research subjects as more than merely tools, or like test tubes, fairy test tubes. In such a view, just flicking back a second for a second. In such a view, choosing to use animals in science, particularly in ways that harm them, should not be decided lightly. And care they are due throughout their use reflects the fact that they are sentient beings and not mere test tubes. Though I cannot discuss them in detail here, but have elsewhere, two other practices also implicating the importance of respect that are gaining ground in laboratory contexts are training animals to cooperate and rehoming suitable animals after use. It is true that these practices can be reasonably motivated by both harm reduction and respect. Training animals can involve many methods, including the use of negative reinforcement, punishment, and restraints. But when done solely using positive reinforcement training, it approaches being a respectful practice and one that avoids using negative stressors. Learned helplessness remains a concern in laboratory contexts. This is where animals will adapt to their circumstances and no longer express their behavioral capacity. They become dampened in their behavioral expression. So learned helplessness remains a concern in laboratory contexts. And so for decisions to only use cooperating animals in a study or experiment to be a sign of respectful use, attention must be paid to how an animal is faring over time and steps taken to protect their capacity to either cooperate or dissent. So you got to keep an eye on their welfare. Rehoming can also be reasonably regarded as motivated by respect when such retirement from research is regarded as something owed to research animals, or where genuine efforts are taken to avoid euthanasia because they could conceivably enjoy a decent life, that is, their basic needs are met, for what time they have remaining in a suitably supportive environment. So rehoming is relocating them outside of a lab. So respect for sentient animals can be legitimately regarded as an emergent fundamental principle of animal research ethics. With these details in place, we can now turn to a Buddhist-infused animal research ethics and its implications for some of the commitments, principles, and practices mentioned in this section. Several commitments in Buddhist philosophy and ethics promise to inform deliberations to use animals in science in ways that will strengthen the emergent principles I've just outlined. The pursuit to ameliorate or eliminate dukkha, to cultivate karuna, commit to ahimsa, all the while recognize the insights of pratitya samutpada, promise to demand more of those who would use animals to benefit humans. I have recently developed and defended 11 draft principles for a non-abolitionist Buddhist animal research ethics, using considerations drawn from reflections on dukkha, karuna, and ahimsa as they are understood within some Buddhist thought. These 11 draft principles can be understood to embody or reflect the fundamental principles already mentioned, though only when the fundamental principles are suitably enriched. Let's take these considerations in turn. As I've said earlier, Buddhism is far too diverse in its understanding of core commitments, including on liberation from samsara, to provide one definitive Buddhist animal research ethics. Likely, one could defend several frameworks, each with equal claim to favored status. That said, the foundational orientation of Buddhist philosophy and practice in Buddha Dharma is captured in the so-called Four Noble Truths. Here, the Buddha Siddhartha Gautama diagnoses the fundamental problem we face in samsara, which is dukkha, identifies the cause we must abandon, attachment or craving, affirms that we can overcome it, and that we achieve this through practicing the Eightfold Path. This is a call to action, rather than merely a statement of four core beliefs, but it's the centrality of dukkha and its elimination that should inform a Buddhist animal research ethics. Dukkha is notoriously difficult to translate into English, though traditionally it has been translated as suffering, pain, and more recently as dissatisfaction or disease. All get a feature of dukkha as explained by the Buddha. The term itself means bad state, and so Buddhist explanations foreground the kinds of bad states that can befall all of us in samsara. Examples include pains that accompany our journey through life, including sickness, old age, and dying, the awareness of impermanence and valued states, that good states will end, and various attachments or cravings. The Buddhist diagnosis of the fundamental problem we face in samsara is not limited to members of our species. All sentient beings in samsara, from celestial beings to hell beings, experience dukkha. Importantly, for our purposes here, so do animals. What's more, intentionally causing animals to experience dukkha should be avoided. And we find proscriptions, for instance, in the Dhammapada. I have a quote, but just for the sake of time, I'll keep going. But there is a quote from Dhammapada 129 to 131, which actually talks about them. The avoidance of causing harm and distress to animals underpins critical discussions of meat eating, like those found in chapter 8 of the Lankavatara Sutra. 3 verses shared by His Holiness the Dalai Lama for cultivating bodhicitta, that is, the thought of awakening, capture the aspirations of the Mahayana soteriological ideal of the Bodhisattva. I'll read those for you. With a wish to free all beings, I shall always go for refuge to the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, until I reach full enlightenment. Enthused by wisdom and compassion, today in the Buddha's presence, I generate the mind for full awakening, bodhicitta, for the benefit of all sentient beings. As long as space endures, as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I too remain and dispel the miseries of the world, unquote. And so that's the cultivation of karuna and himsa. It is important to note how the quoted passages also bring together karuna and himsa. Karuna, compassion or care, is not merely a feeling arising from seeing or knowing about the distress or suffering of others, but rather something that moves one to end them. This is captured in the 3 verses to cultivate bodhicitta just cited. The Theravadan commentator Buddhaghosa also describes karuna in that way, and just for the sake of time, I'll skip over that quote, but it's certainly there in his Path of Purification commentaries. Ahimsa is captured by prescriptions against harming and killing, as I've just referenced in there, or mentioned or suggested is there in the Dhammapada. This commitment, shared by all the great living philosophical religious traditions of South Asia, is also reflected in what is known as the first of the 5 precepts in Buddhism. I undertake the precept to refrain from destroying living creatures. As noted by Bhikkhu Bodhi, this precept concerns all sentient beings and has to actually meet 5 conditions, including that they are a living being, that they're perceived that way, that there's a thought to kill them, there's an effort to do it, and the actual death results. Though as noted by Bodhi, the seriousness of killing partially depends on who is killed, such that killing animals is less morally significant than, say, killing virtuous humans. The precept nevertheless prescribes intentionally killing sentient animals. How's my time, Jobin, at the minute? Your audio isn't coming through, I can't hear.
You can continue for about 12 minutes more. 12 minutes more. Yeah.
I'll speed it up a bit then, just to speed up.
I mean, yeah, that's fine.
Putting things together, you might actually be inclined to think, well, the solution for Buddhist research ethics is, well, this research shouldn't happen with other animals. I think that's I think that moves too fast, because I think it cuts off Buddhism from actually intersecting with what's going on the ground. And I think there's several reasons to keep moving. That is, to keep developing a Buddhist infused animal research ethics that doesn't actually just stop it all at once. One is that animals themselves can benefit from this research. Think of veterinary medicine. And so that's going to be particularly useful here. Even when they're actually using animals to benefit humans as well, doesn't mean we can't actually change practice in a way that reflects a Buddhist infused ethics and benefits the animals used. Second, in abolitionist Buddhist research ethics won't have anything to add to the current discussion. That is, it'll just be saying no, so it'll certainly be a part of that discussion, but it won't add to what's happening on the ground. And I think that's actually a disadvantage to all of us working in animal research ethics, just to cut that short. Partly it's because Care is very hard to motivate in Western ethics. You got to argue for it. I know that sounds crazy, but you got to argue for it. For a number of us working in animal research ethics, it's incredibly frustrating. It should be some of the first things that we use in ethics. It's not. Also, because of Descartes, that is René Descartes in France, his ghost is very much in play in animal research. And so that facilitates or enables a great deal of skepticism about sentience in other animals and allows an end run around concerns about harm. That's not going to happen within a Buddhist infused animal research ethics. And so it's very important to see that. Also, for those of you who may not know, Russell and Birch, who actually originate the 3 Rs, were not skeptics of sentience in vertebrates. They, in fact, quite clearly state that in their book. And so from their perspective, you don't get away from that. There is this complication as well that arises from meat eating in the Buddhist world. And so the fact that meat eating happens complicates this terrain. Even if we actually take this as a non-ideal context, that is, although Buddhists may eat meat, they're well aware they should actually be working or making an effort to move beyond it. And even the Dalai Lama eats meat, so it's not something to simply be dismissed as something that's only true of the uncommitted. No, it's true of the committed as well. And I know meat eating is a very complicated discussion to be had in Buddhist practice. The Vinaya has some complicated rules around this. That is the code for monastics. It nevertheless shows us that there is a way to bring in death and killing in a way that will actually intersect on the ground with animal research ethics and still allow for a Buddhist infused discussion. That said, as we can actually expect more from animal farmers, we can expect more from animal scientists. In section 3, we discussed 3 fundamental principles present in Western literature and animal research ethics: non-maleficence, sufficient benefit, and respect for animals. A Buddhist reading of these fundamental principles will front and center dukkha and the importance of avoiding causing dukkha when using animals in science. Karuna will require that animal technicians and researchers are deeply responsive to animal needs. Ahimsa will require that scientists and their laboratory team reject the current default that permits killing most of the animal research subjects used in science. There are several ways in which this can change the way animals are used in science, as I describe in 11 draft principles for a non-abolitionist Buddhist animal research ethics. And so I'll just skip this slide, but there are the reasons for the moving beyond the abolitionist framework. But here are the 11 draft principles. I'll not go through them all, I'll just draw your attention to some detail. Several things should be noted. First, as causing dukkha is to be avoided, it is a prima facie wrong to intentionally harm an animal in research. Prima facie refers to what is typical, permitting some exceptions in exceptional circumstances. Second, as with humans in research, harms of a certain degree are less objectionable if the animals being harmed stand to benefit. Where they do not stand to benefit, the risk of harm should not exceed what they ordinarily face on a day-to-day basis in settings where the harms are not anthropogenic, that is, we don't cause them. This mirrors minimal risk in human research ethics. Third, the 3 Rs still have a place because once proposed research aligns with the sort of standards I've just outlined, researchers should go through the 3 R steps so as to minimize the harms arising from scientific use. Fourth, cooperation and dissent enjoy greater prominence in Buddhist infused animal research ethics as they both avoid the harms arising from forcing animals to participate in research and better reflect the Buddhist aspiration to help sentient beings escape dukkha. Fifth, as ideally killing should be avoided, a Buddhist infused research ethics will strongly favor rehoming suitable animals after use. We need another principle to actually finish off this frame and also connect back to the second framing in COVID-19. And so I'll now push on to another one that we didn't talk about yet, and that is praticca samutpada. This last concept I'll be using has to do with dependent origination, and it's a view that to quote Keown, all phenomena arise in dependence on causes and conditions and lack intrinsic being. From a quote from the Buddhist Sutta Pitaka, when this is, that is. From the arising of this comes the arising of that. When this isn't, that isn't. From the cessation of this comes the cessation of that. That's a quotation from Samyutta Nikaya. Peter Harvey also sums it up and just brings out the fact that this is a causal analysis that has to do with conditions. Fundamentally, everything we see around us exists because of their supporting conditions. Remove those conditions and those things, or states of affairs cease to exist. This is clear soteriological import in Buddhism and is used to explain our experience of dukkha and our continuing rebirths. For my purposes, it is important to recognize that pratitya samutpada functions to instill an awareness of our contributions in morally undesirable conditions. Where killing, at least as it often occurs in animal research, is largely off the table in the Buddhist-infused animal research ethics, what should be done with animals after the scientific use is completed becomes a complicated logistical challenge. Pratitya samutpada requires researchers to be more mindful of such a challenge because they pursue their science or even build up the animal populations in their laboratories. Where they can anticipate that they will not be able to rehome many animals after use, this should curtail the number of animals they propose to use and to house in their laboratories. And that brings us back to the remaining content that I wanted to highlight in those principles. How this discussion affects what I was outlining in the second section should be fairly clear. As universities look to build back their animal populations to levels adequate for studies researchers want to pursue, a Buddhist-infused ethics will preclude building them to such large numbers that they must be killed in a time of crisis, like the COVID-19 pandemic. Universities containing laboratories conducting animal-based science must have clear and efficient plans in place to see suitable animals rehomed after use. Laboratories and universities that cannot meet these conditions of use will be unable to use animals ethically, according to a Buddhist-infused animal research ethics. The use of animals in vaccine development must be better geared toward benefiting the animals used. Where it is unlikely that the animals will benefit from this use, they should not face a greater than minimal risk. As ideally, killing should be avoided. The challenges animals face in research should not be life-threatening, or should their use require their death when the research is concluded. This means that the default should be that these animals will be rehomed after use. Where they cannot be rehomed despite their suitability, the use will not qualify as ethical in a Buddhist-infused research animal ethics. So some conclusions. A significant part of this paper consisted of introducing a number of Buddhist commitments and then briefly relating them to animal research and Western animal research ethics. I've shown that a non-abolitionist Buddhist-infused animal ethics can place significant demands on those who would ethically use animals in science. I closed the last section by showing how this should impact laboratory crisis management plans and the use of animal models in vaccine research. Pratitya samutpada also has something relevant to contribute to the framings of COVID-19 with which I opened the paper. The COVID-19 pandemic did not fall as a stone from heaven. Zoonotic pandemics such as this one are tied to practices that can and should change. As a global community, we must take habitat loss and incursion much more seriously than we have. Human-wildlife encounters significantly raises the chances of spillover events. Crowded conditions for live, stressed-out animals are perfect breeding grounds for dangerous viruses. Such farming, which is typical now in the so-called West and becoming typical elsewhere in the world, such farming and live market practices must stop. We may not eliminate the possibility of any future zoonotic pandemics, but eliminating these conditions, but by eliminating these conditions, we massively reduce the possibility of a zoonotic pandemic like COVID-19. And that's it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for that talk on a Buddhist-infused animal research ethics. So it's especially interesting for us in India because we hear about Indian languages have all these words, right? Dukkha, Karuna, all these words you're very familiar with. So we, I mean, in some sense, this should be closer to our conceptual world. So I'm expecting some more questions.
Yeah, and also, well needed, like sorely needed in so-called Western animal research ethics, because arguably we're pushing the limits of the ethical frames in so-called Western ethics, and so we need a much more global, like an honest global discussion of what so-called Western ethics are missing. And I think looking to the great religious traditions of South Asia is sorely needed to actually see what direction we should go in for the future.
Okay, Andrew, here's a question from Kaveri. And the question is, any local initiatives that can make it to the grassroots level, make it to grassroots level changes that can probably result in grassroots level changes in the world over?
It's a good question. I think there's two big ones, and they're two big ones because a number of scientists are fighting them. So you always know there's two big ones when there's a number of scientists going, no, we don't want to do this. So here's two, the ones I've mentioned. So one is using positive reinforcement training, but only positive reinforcement training when you're training animals. The reason why not all scientists resist this, there's a growing move to do this, but it's expensive because you have to actually hire the trainers to do it. You have to build a relationship with the animals to actually do this successfully. And you have to slow down the process of research. And so a number of scientists are going, no. It's good for the animals to actually train them. It deals with a whole bunch of stressors. It's both enhances their welfare in a captive context, but also it shows more respect, frankly, because they're agents, and you got to respect them as agents. If you don't, they try to escape, and so they end up using restraints or negative reinforcers, so they'll end up banging cages or threatening them, and that's just not respectful. The second one is rehoming. So this is one that's really gaining momentum. They tend to favor domestic animals that are companion animals at the minute. So it tends to favor cats and dogs, which I think is overly limited. There's no reason to do it that way. And when I've talked to animal scientists about this, when I say to them, you really should be thinking about this for rodents, they go apoplectic and go, are you kidding me? Do you know how many rodents we use in our labs? But that's not a problem for me. That's a problem for them. And so I think those are two on the ground things that can be pushed. So using positive reinforcement training, but only positive reinforcement training, and rehoming the animals after use.
Okay, yeah. So I'm waiting for some more questions, but in the meanwhile, I'll ask you. You mentioned this Descartes figure, right? As someone who really contributed to this idea of human uniqueness in some sense.
Yeah, he did.
So, so how would things have been before Descartes? I mean, before this philosophical position became prominent?
It's a good question. I think how it would have been, there's one thing that wouldn't have changed, at least for a number of scholastics, that is members of the medieval guilds that were actually writing in philosophy. And one thing that would have changed. So the thing that would have changed is, because you'll get this, so for the scholastics in the medieval period that Descartes is influenced by, they're mostly Christian, some of them are Muslim. But for a number of the Christian scholastics and the Muslim scholastics, they're not going to deny that other animals have emotions, like rich emotions. So they're not going to deny things like fear, and they're not going to deny things like love. But for the scholastics, for people like Thomas Aquinas, Thomas Aquinas didn't think that we had direct duties to other animals because they just weren't like us. They didn't have self-awareness. They weren't moral agents. And so he didn't think that we had moral obligations to them. So that wouldn't have changed with Descartes because he certainly didn't think we had moral obligations to other animals. What would have changed was that Descartes ended up providing a way of denying that they even had emotions like rich mental life, where they experienced states that tie into dukkha as it's understood in both what we now call Hinduism and Buddhism, Jainism, the Sikh tradition. Dukkha, as it is understood within all of those philosophical religious traditions, is denied of animals through a Cartesian lens. And that just facilitates a whole bunch of skepticism, or at least convenient skepticism among scientists in the so-called West and elsewhere.
So after Kaveri, I haven't got. Yeah, there's another question coming. So this is even having pets change their original nature through providing them with comfortable living conditions, dressing up pets like humans, making them obey human commands for earning and participating in competitions. What would be an ethical take on that? I mean,
that's a good question. Domestication of animals is actually a very difficult one. You're right, we've changed some of their natures profoundly. Dogs in particular. Cats are always also changing, so they're becoming more neotenous, which means the juvenile characteristics are extending more into their adult stage. With dogs, this is just true. Domestic dogs, all breeds, are neotonic in their expression. That is, they maintain juvenile characteristics into their adulthood, unlike wolves and coyotes. So it's very different, even though they can interbreed. That's a real difference. Those kinds of changes have been done. So the damage has been done there. I think the most important thing for these animals is to continue to respect their agency. So I think for those of us who live with other animals, so those of us who live in homo animal family units, we need to go out of our, I think we need to actually make the effort. I was going to say go out of our way, but it's not going our way. We need to make the effort to respect their agency, so to respect their preferences and desires, unless it's not in their interests. And even then, we have to be very careful not to harm them as we navigate that terrain. So it's a lovely question. It's very complicated. There are some philosophers that think that we should actually phase out domestic animals. I'm sympathetic to the debate. I think it's a debate that's worth having. The animals we adopt in our household, we have 3 domestic cats we get from animal shelters. We don't get breeders. I think breeders are an important problem in this issue. But for as long as there are animals in shelters, I think there is an obligation among those of us who can to adopt them and give them a life worth living.
Okay, and here's a question from Rohit. And the question is, what do you think is a better way of ensuring animal rights? Is it scientific outlook or a traditional faith-oriented one?
That's a good question. I don't think there's going to be any straight answer to that. I think the proof will be in the pudding. And given how young this debate is, I mean, as I was purposely did with my opening slide, I think if you're actually thinking in rights in terms of entitlement, I think animal rights go back to India. And so this is not a new debate in some ways. So when you think of Ashoka Maurya and what Ashoka tried to do with his edicts to ensure things like animal hospitals, for instance, those edicts can be read as an entitlement. And if you think of rights as entitlements, that's not crazy. Actually, animal rights, I think, first starts in places like India. And so there's where religious discourse becomes very important. I think both have a place a role to play. So science has actually revealed, to push back against Cartesian frameworks, science continues to reveal a great deal of depth to the mental lives of other animals. I work a lot reading about chimpanzees and talking about chimpanzees. They're the animals that I'm most comfortable talking about, apart from the domestic cats I live with. Science has revealed a lot about that. There's actually a lot of similarities among us and other animals. You get this recognized in various Buddhist discussions, as I was hinting at the paper or quoting. So His Holiness the Dalai Lama will actually bring this out. You see it in the Dhammapada. You'll see it throughout the Sutta Pitaka. So throughout the Sutta Pitaka, you'll see the Buddha talk in ways that evince from his perspective a belief in the rich lives of animals. And so I think they're both coming together now, and I think that's useful. Because I think there'll be a number of scientists resistant to a religious lens. And so I think both can be used to good effect. But in the end, the question's a good one, proof's in the pudding. It may turn out that revamping the framework so that it's much more sensitive to philosophical religious frameworks coming out of places like South Asia may be the way to go. Certainly my heart lies with Buddhism, which is why I focus on it. I think fundamentally a number of the Buddhist insights on dukkha and resisting dukkha or overcoming dukkha are fundamentally right. And so I think they can't be ignored.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. I think Kaveri has actually just made a point that, there is idealism, there's a mix of idealism and practical sense. So that is probably what you're trying to bring in a Buddhist infused research ethics, I think.
Yeah, the way to do it in so-called Western ethics is they talk about ideal and non-ideal theory. So ideal theory is, the best of all possible worlds. Non-ideal theory is where we find ourselves. The trick to it is not to lose sight of the ideal theory. So the trick is not to because once you lose sight of the non-ideal theory, there's nowhere to go. And so if you have a non-ideal theory that just simply says, well, we have to start where we are and we'll just use it strategically. If you don't have the ideal theory in place, it'll not improve. So you need to have both in play. And so you need to push the non-ideal framework. And so this is going to be hard work. It's going to take a lot of effort. But the eye on the prize is the best of all possible worlds. We shouldn't accept anything less as we work on the ground. And so this is why these moves are moves that we need to defend. We need to defend them in ways that can be recognized by folks who don't share the relevant philosophical religious framework. I think they can be. This is what I do when I present these kinds of Buddhist-infused frameworks to folks who are Western or aren't familiar with them. And from my experience talking to folks about them, they're very receptive. There is an opening within science, including animal science, to having these discussions. There's lots, I work with some now. There are lots of animal researchers who are very uncomfortable with what they do, and they want to have a way to actually better understand what they do. And I think this actually will benefit them, not just animals.
Actually, I was going to ask the same question, about the scientific community's response to this thing. Anyway, I think we have run out of time, Andrew. So it's just
Sure.
5. So we have to start with the next session. So thank you so much for speaking to us. It was very informative, and also, the ideas, the ethical sense, it's a good way to end the session, with some thoughts about Karuna and all that.
Thanks. And thanks for the opportunity. It was lovely to actually do this.
Thank you. All right, so I will end that session.
Thank you, Dr. Fenton, for that wonderful session. So now we have reached the final part of this virtual conference on contagion narratives, the society, culture, and ecology of the global south. So now we're Professor Ajanta Sirkar. Yeah. So she'll be delivering the valedictory talk. Yeah.
Sreejith, can you hear me?
Yeah. Over to you, ma'am.
Okay. So first of all, thank you to Dr. Sreejith and to Dr. Jobin for this wonderful opportunity. I want to begin by thanking the management of VIT, the Dean SSL, and the HOD English. I'm reading from another screener for their help and support in organizing this conference. And especially in these dark times, when the very idea of critical thinking is under such ferocious assault, it is a privilege to enjoy the kind of intellectual freedom that we continue to do here. My warmest congratulations to the organizers. Their expansive imagination of the idea of contagion helped to bring together the most distinguished scholars across an astonishing range of disciplines, from literature, history, economics, film studies, medicine, epidemiology, and now to this really sort of wonderful paper on medical research in animals. We are deeply grateful to all of you for participating in our deliberations. And while the paper was too close to my already prepared little speech, I want to especially acknowledge a fundamental insight of Professor Fenton from my guru, that is Dr. Sigmund Freud, who tells us repeatedly that Western ethics is pre-programmed to war. But I also want to do it with a note of caution, because I'm especially aware of the ways in which, in the context of Myanmar, in the context of Sri Lanka, Buddhism has now repeatedly been used as a religion of horrific violence. So what are the final takeaways? For me, in some ways, the takeaways were actually quite simple. to listen to each other and to learn from each other across our disciplinary silos much more carefully than we have done so far. The effortful issue that emerges then is, how does one actually do this kind of transdisciplinary research without diluting the conceptual or methodological rigor of the specific disciplines we come from? How does one really become comparative in our literacies, whether of comparative modernities, comparative capitalisms, or the way we relate to quote unquote nature? Related to this, one theme which seemed to emerge across many papers was to think more seriously about the idea of contingency, to break out of linear ideas of historical causality as represented in the classic realist text. While fully agreeing with this general proposition, unlike Professor Dilip Menon, however, I have reservations about the idea of the benevolent paternalistic capitalism that he proposed or seemed to propose as an alternative. I want to recall instead the idea of contingency that was very clearly available both to Karl Marx and to Antonio Gramsci, especially as Gramsci analyzed the initial moments of the Bolshevik Revolution and noted how it had bypassed the classical route to socialism. The other related theme, and in the background, was how the neoliberal economy, driven by the new data technology companies, has braided in with new varieties of populisms across the world today, and how melodrama as a performative idiom must be a central category of analysis for political theory. In these sets of observations, I'm especially indebted to the work of political theorist Partha Chatterjee, who has been among the rare and key thinkers to have taken on board this insight in a very central way. This is, of course, furthermore, a stage of capitalism that is making large segments of the working class everywhere redundant, those now classified as essential services. But this is not, to my mind, a return to a simple classical colonialism, even while many have noted a return of the repressed across the political divide. So how then do we calibrate our counterattacks, and where is the hope? To me, it is not just the undoing of simple binaries, which many of the learned papers referred to, nature, culture, human, non-human, etc., but also in acknowledging that criticality is itself a barbaric mess. Human life subject to contradictions and uncertainty. It is possible for a person to love in more than one direction, and sometimes to be torn into pieces because of one's many loves. I owe, as I said before, such an understanding of criticality, especially to the ambiguities of Freudian psychoanalysis, which both perpetuates a civilized savage divide, but also by showing how barbarism lurks inside the civilized, including critically the European, subverts that divide. For me, furthermore, the subversive train of psychoanalysis is especially in the way in which it tracks the essentially lawless workings of sex and violence. Trauma is a fundamental category to Freud's analysis of the human mind. Further, his architecture of the mind, his insights on the origins of ethics, on emotions such as shame, violence, murderous rage, hatred, to me seem to have profound relevance in the darkness today. And I want to end with ethics of care, with the ethics of care that were also mentioned by several presenters before. And here I have in mind, of course, not only philosophers such as Emmanuel Levinas or Jacques Derrida, but also especially child analyst Melanie Klein, who turns repeatedly to the question, how do we make whole again internal worlds decimated by violence and aggression? Until the time that we are able to acknowledge the violence within, can we actually stop the violence without? And I want to end by stressing that our care, our ethics of care and precarity must also ask the really difficult questions of atonement and forgiveness. Can some people never be forgiven because of who they are and the responsibility they bear for their actions? How do we know, or how do we judge if someone has truly atoned? And with these brief reflections, I thank all of you again for your time and for your scholarship. And we look forward to welcoming you in post-COVID times to our beautiful deliberations, to our beautiful campus for further deliberations. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Rajendra Sarkar, for that, for beautifully summing up this conference. So, as organizers, both Jobin and I, we believe that we have put together an interesting conference. So in this conference, we had 4 plenary sessions, of course, in addition to keynote addressed by Professor Karen Thornberg. We had 4 plenary sessions and a panel discussions. And we were able to bring to you over 40 paper presentations that employ diverse approaches and vantage points. And so we are pleased that this kind of potpourri of approaches that we have been able to touch upon. So as you know, like we know that Contagion kind of thrives on this contiguity of or proximity of individual bodies. So just like that, this conference, I think, fed on this contiguity of approaches. But I believe a major hallmark of this conference is that this is organized by the Department of English, Humanities, School of Humanities and Social Sciences. Because sometimes academia and society kind of fail to acknowledge the contribution of making sense of catastrophic events like a contagion or pandemic by the humanities. Because we usually associate a contagion with science. And I also believe that there are 2 different aspects of contagion that we emphasize. The first one is caretaking. So this includes taking care of yourselves and your bodies. And the second one is hygienity, taking personal hygiene. But we believe we need to expand these notions to planetary terms so that taking care means taking care of this planet or the environment. And by hygiene, we can mean keeping the environment clean. So I know that I am touching upon ecosophy a little bit here, but we are kind of forced to become armchair philosophers in these pandemic times because there is nowhere else for us to go rather than being in our armchair. So anyway, let's hope that this pandemic has given us many ways to rethink kind of several of our presuppositions, including our relationship among humans and between human and non-human. And we'll be gratified if this conference has energized towards this direction. And thanks everyone for your participation. And we look forward to your support for any more events that VIT might be bringing to you. So thank you, and I'll just hand over to Dr. Jobin.
Thank you, Sreejith. I mean, you have beautifully presented everything I wanted to say. So I also have nothing more to say. Actually, we can conclude.
So I think we can end this session. Yeah. So thank you, everybody.